All right. Osio, Maburiga, welcome to the Red Road East. I'm your host, Fierce Truth Seeker. And back by popular demand, we have part three of what became of the Moors of Europe. And returning is Dr. Fatou Diarra. And she was weighing in real heavy with the DNA and how it relates to the Moors, indigenous peoples, those who were enslaved, and how it all connects. So, I also have joined with me my co host, Firebird Grey Wolf. And right about now, I'm going to bring these wonderful ladies to the panel and I'm going to unmute their mics. And hey, Osio, peace.
Peace.
Yeah. All right.
Yo,
So,
doctor.
Hi, how are you? How are
Fine
you?
blessings.
Greetings.
yeah. So, um, let me get these slides pulled up here.
I like your glasses.
Here. Okay. So is this it? Okay. Now, do you remember the number,
Um,
the slide number that we left off on?
um, go to go to 90, and then I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was around there, and I'll recognize where you are.
Okay. Let's do it like that. Oh, yeah. I think it was 90.
Oh wow, I remembered it.
Uh-huh. Let's see. Um,
It should say Jews and Muslims in British colonial America. It's actually a pick of a book.
okay. Is that it?
Oh no, we went past that. We definitely
Okay,
went past.
that's 90.
Okay,
Let's see.
we definitely went past that.
What
All
about
past.
this?
Oh no. We went past that.
You went past that? Okay.
Yeah, keep
That.
going. Keep 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 going. There, right there. Go back. Go back. Go back. That's it. That's where. That's what I'm ready to start with.
Right
Right.
here.
Right here.
Okay. Let me make this a little bigger. Full screen layout. Okay. And the floor is yours. I'll
Okay.
mute
So
my
this.
mic.
Okay. Alrighty. So this is part 3 of the Moors, who they were, how they were in Europe, and the relationship between the Moors of Europe and the populations in the Caribbean and what became of the people in the colonies. So just to briefly summarize what I already covered, I covered who were the Moors. I covered the description or the images that we have of the Moors, the paintings. I covered the genetic groups that comprised the Moors, which was the West African and the North African. The genetic evidence of the Moorish DNA in Europe from ancient times. I showed examples of Europeans today and how they have tiny markers which reflect the more ancient part of them that still contains West African. So we looked at people from Italy, Sicily, Portugal, Spain, even Britain, Scotland, Ireland, and the tiny West African DNA markers from Nigerian, Ghanaian, Senegambian, all of those markers, North African. I explained that North Africa today is in terms of genetic description, is a modern construct because this is based on the miscegenated populations that they test and not the darker populations, but the miscegenated populations who then serve as the reference as to what a North African is. I explained the genesis of the people that are called Amizigh. Sometimes they're known as Berbers, but they prefer to be called Amizigh. I explained how they migrated from the Horn, and there was a people more ancient living there. And those people are the Bafour people, who are the antecedents of the Mandi speakers, who are really the greatest component of the West African populations. Pretty much majority of the West African population, minus the Yoruba, all have some sort of indirect or direct relationship to the Bafour people. So the Bafour people were in Northwest Africa because back then there was no desert. It was fertile in that area. And then as the expansion of the desert, they also started to move down. And then also you had the migration of the people from the Horn, and they went into North Africa and they dominated what would be the Bafour people. And of course, there's merging. So this is why North African Berbers, Amizigh people have a characteristic that I will go into. I showed in the first presentation, and they possess 4 West African groups simultaneously, as opposed to the other West Africans who will just have, let's say, DNA that they call Yoruba or Akan or Ghanaian. Those other West Africans will have 1 to 2 genetic categories. The Amizigh people, they have by characteristics 4 genetic groups. Okay, we will often see a Bantu reference group. You will see a Senegambian, Ghanaian. You will see Nigerian or Yoruba, and yes, Senegambian, Ghanaian, Nigeria, and a Bantu group all together simultaneously. I call that the Amizigh pattern, and we will see that that is a pattern that we have. So, now I'm going to show what took place, the history, and the proof, the genetic proof that these people in Europe that we're calling Moors, be them the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula or Northwest European Moors, were the people primarily that influenced the genetic pattern that we see today showing up as West African or North African DNA. Okay, so this is a group, this is a book rather, called Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America. It was written and co-authored by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. Donald Yates founded DNA Consultants, which is a private small DNA company. And Elizabeth Hirschman, her name is actually Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman. She actually is a Melungeon, and she's put out a number of books, and she's a professor. I don't know if she's retired yet, but she's put out a lot of historical documents with some DNA studies as well, talking about the Melungeons, who used to be considered an enigma, but they're not an enigma anymore. We know that the Melungeons basically are part descendants of Sephardic Jews and Moors. They were darker, and in recent times they lightened up, and they faced discrimination. They intermingled with the indigenous population, and many of them migrated, and they started off in the Virginia, North Carolina area, and they migrated into the Appalachians, West Virginia, and we have many famous Americans that descend from them. So that is what this text deal with, and they deal with the genesis of that population out of the Iberian Peninsula. Next slide.
Yeah, it's good you mentioned Yates. I reference Yates in my book, actually.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's just a little excerpt out of the same book that I'm showing. And they basically talk about how you had the Sephardic and Morisco population, the Moorish population of Spain, which actually also is Portugal as well. Spain, just not Spain, but what became Portugal, fleeing after 1492 to France, the Dutch Republic, and England. And this is very important because it is that source that we will see, the source of a type of DNA that shows up in our DNA as so-called African Americans and Caribbean people. Next slide. So this is an article that talks about Black Africans in 7th century Amsterdam. Okay, the name of this particular article, if anybody wants to go back and read it, is Black Africans in 17th century Amsterdam by Dinky Hondius. And the reason why I'm showing this, because in this article, you can go to the next slide. They talk about how Spanish merchants brought African servants to Northern Europe, thereby introducing Black Africans to white Northwestern Europe, cities in the Netherlands and Germany. Well, now that's not really true, because the Moors were established in what became Germany. The Moors were quite established there. Okay, so what I'm really showing by reading this article, what you see is that there was an additional influx of Iberian Moors that they're calling African slaves, because the Iberian Moors, at this point, there was a whole switchover. There were wars taking place, and they were subdued. Well, they started fleeing, as we saw in the book by Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman and Donald Yates. They talked about a movement from Spain, Portugal, into these areas. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Is just that they are making these Moors slaves and servants. But you can see here they're talking about a movement into the Netherlands, and the genesis is from the Iberian Peninsula. It's not as if there wasn't established Moors in these areas, but what I'm showing is there's a new influx of Moors, Sephardic Jews who were Black and dark skinned, okay, and African phenotype coming in from the Iberian Peninsula. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so in this particular paragraph, you can see they're talking about the discrimination against Black African Jews, Portuguese Jews they're acknowledging that they were Black African, that these Sephardic Jews were Black African, and there was discrimination from the white Jews. And so the point I'm making is that when we start hearing about Sephardic Jews, Portuguese Jews, we have to also understand many of them were quite dark, and they were indistinguishable from other Africans. Okay, that's the point I'm making with that slide. Next slide. Okay, so I have a part here highlighted They're working with Haggard's transcription of the old Portuguese records. My research into these community records and some of the Amsterdam city notaries office records show by the early 17th century, quite a few Black Africans had found their way to the city of Amsterdam. We know this because Black Africans are named and described by their skin color, okay? So many of them, as I said before, came out of the Iberian Peninsula during the period of the Inquisition. Okay, next slide. And I have a part here highlighted that I just finished talking about. The part that I have highlighted, it says, of these categories, the first written restrictions she has found are about Blacks and mulattoes of Jewish origin. These rules show that there were at least two groups among the Africans in Amsterdam, slaves, servants, and mulattoes, who were religious Jews and acknowledged as such, and those who were not recognized as Jews. Black male religious Jews were circumcised, and both men and women had to take the ritual bath. So the only point I'm trying to make here, this article is clearly showing you that there was a sizable Black Jewish population in Europe, and the genesis of these people came out of the Iberian Peninsula. So we're often led to believe that Abrahamic religions were something that was imposed on us through a whip. This is actually not 100% true. Many of the part of our lineage that came in, right, from Europe, actually they were Christians, they were Muslims, and they were Jews. This is a lie to think that any knowledge of Abrahamic religion was 100%, it came in through white people. That's a lie. That does not apply to us. I'm not saying that it didn't come in through colonialism, but it's a way we're taught to think that European equals white. These are Europeans. They're Black.
Yep, I tell people that all the time.
All right, that's deliberately taught to us, that European equals white. None of this is in Africa. All of this is in Europe. And as we can see, there are Black Jews. All right. So we're going to move forward because we're going to deal with whatever happened to these people and how does this relate to us, which is the key. Next slide. Okay, so this is an article here, Black people in Europe. And so it's talking about from the 1450s. See, that's key. That's around during the Inquisition period. The Portuguese transported thousands of enslaved Africans to Spain, Portugal, and Italy to work as servants or in the fields. Lisbon, for instance, had a significant African population from the 16th century. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't a slave trade, but understand that area had a sizable Moorish and Sephardic Jewish Black population that was African genetically, okay, that lived there. And they were living there for centuries. All right, next slide. You can go, that's a blank. Go to the next slide. All right, so this is an open letter by Queen Elizabeth I. So fast forward, now we're going from the 1490s, the period of the Inquisition. You have all these wars taking place in the Iberian Peninsula. You have people now hiding. You have Black Jews hiding, converting over to Christianity. You have the Islamic Moors also converting to Christianity, and you have this big exodus, as was stated by historians, where you have a movement into Amsterdam. I just showed that. Then you have a movement into England. So here's Queen Elizabeth I, okay? And she writes a letter, and let's move on, okay? And one of the things I have it highlighted that she says, now we're in the 1600s. She goes, Her Majesty, understanding that there are of late divers blackamoors brought into the realm, of which kind of people there are already here too many, considering how God have blessed this land with great increase of people of our own nation, yada, yada, yada. So basically, Queen Elizabeth I is complaining about the surplus of people, blackamoors, that came from the Iberian Peninsula. So as I always say, when something is true, it shows up in several places, whether it's history or genetic pattern. Okay, so now we can see that there was this transfer of these people to England. Okay, now we're building up to how this relates to us. Next slide. So this is now I'm start dealing with the different populations here in the Americas. Let's talk about Haiti, okay? Because a lot of people don't understand. You know, there's this confusion: are Haitians indigenous? Are they African? I'm going to tell you something. They are both. Okay, they are both. Now this deals with the genesis of how the Haitian people started off. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you can look here. This is an article called The First Haitian Revolution. Okay, and they talk about how the original people, not the original inhabitants, but that the people that came in were the Black Ladinos. They were the first Africans from Spain, known as Ladino. Okay, and the African Bozales. The Bozales were continental Africans, because you had some slave trading. The Portuguese did take some what we would call animus, and they were enslaved. I mean, you had African Muslims, you had Africans of Abrahamic faith that considered Africans who were animists beneath them. So we have to also understand that division exists. So you had a combination of these two people that were sent, okay, and who labored along the Taino and Spanish mines. So understand, wherever the pale European went, the darker Moors who were subdued were sent as the slaves. That's the part they don't tell you. And as we go further down, I'm going to prove to you that that is the case. Okay, so this is the genesis of the initial population in Haiti. You have a combination of people coming out of the Iberian Peninsula, the Moors, the Sephardic Jews who converted, who are now Christians, and they are alongside the Taino people. Okay, and you will see that is what Haitians share in common with Dominicans and other people in the Caribbean. Okay, next slide. So this is also an article, an excerpt from an article talking about maroon societies. And they talk about Jamaica as an example. And just like Haiti, these maroon societies, okay, because basically the beginning part of Haiti, that was a maroon society, meaning it was a combination of Iberian Moors, Sephardic Jews who converted over to Christianity, okay, and they were sent there to mine gold and to basically, work with the cattle, and they were enslaved and they worked alongside the Tainos. That was the establishment of the maroon communities. The same applies to Jamaicans, maroons. That is exactly how that was established as well. And you can see here, it says perhaps the most well-known maroon societies are the ones that existed and in fact still exist in Jamaica. Maroon societies in Jamaica can trace their roots back to the 1500s, when the ruling Spanish captured African Muslims, parentheses, living in Spain at the time. So here they're more honest. They're admitting that these people were not from somewhere else. They were from Spain, also Portugal, by the way, enslaved them and brought them to Jamaica. This is what happened in Haiti, okay? The maroon communities were begun 150 years later when the Spanish left Jamaica to the English in 1655. And some of the slaves they had brought over were left behind, okay? These are Iberian Moors, Sephardic Jews descendants, okay? News of the Spanish maroon community soon spread among the British slaves, and many of them escaped, joining the maroons already living in the mountains, okay? Differences in language and culture. The British slaves were African descent. We're going to talk about that, because the British slaves, contrary to what's promoted, was not primarily directly from West Africa. The British didn't even deal with West Africa until much later. These African slaves that the British brought came from Northwest Europe, and we're going to see that, and I have the proof of that. Okay, so we can turn to the next slide. All right, so you have this book here, also written by Yates and co-authored with Jarvis and Levin, called The Book of Jewish and Crypto-Jewish Surnames. Why is this important? Because, as I stated, many of the initial, what they call African slaves that came into the Caribbean and into the colonies were, in fact, from Europe. Okay, and like I said, many of them were Jews and Muslims who had converted over into Christianity because there was, they were getting slaughtered. I mean, these were religious wars. So the truth of the origin is hidden in many of the surnames. So a lot of the surnames that we have are actually Jewish. They come from these men, okay, these so-called African slave men from the 1600s, and some of them are really just crypto-Jewish and Moorish surnames. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in page 26 of that same book, it says a book of Jewish and crypto-Jewish surnames, according to a detailed genetic haplotype survey, what Kennedy proposed was born out of hard science. The Melungeons were in large part a Sephardic Jewish and Moorish community that began as early as 1540 with De Soto expedition to the southeastern United States. So when it comes to what became the United States, you also had an exodus of these people coming into the colonies even before the 1600s. Just like in the 1500s, you had the same thing going on with the Caribbean, and I talked about that with Haiti and Jamaica, okay? So wherever the Spaniards went, they brought their Moors. Whether they converted over to Christianity is not the issue, but they bought them and they used them for labor, or they used them in their armies, okay? Next slide. So these are common Melungeon surnames. Now, let me just say this before I continue. Melungeons, they descend from the Sephardic Jews and the Moors, but so do we. And this is what we have in common. So for those of us that participate in genetic studies, many of these white distant cousins are in fact whitened up descendants of Melungeons. That's actually how many of us are related to them. Okay, and you will notice that we share many surnames. What people will say, oh, that sounds like a black surname, certain surnames like Watkins, Watson, the typical types of surnames, Davis, that we tend to have in the Afro-American and the Caribbean community. You will notice that the Melungeons also share those surnames. So you cannot assume this is from slavery. As a matter of fact, from what I've read, only 15% of surnames that so-called African Americans have come from slave owners. So where do the rest come from? Some of them we gave to ourselves or we changed, but another big source would be the original Moors and Sephardic Jews that came in. Of course, they didn't come in with those identities. They came in as black men or Negroes or whatever, but these surnames belong to them. So let's look at some of the common names. I'm not going to go through every last one. You can, read it on your own. But I'm sure when you look at that list, Adams, Atkins, Allen, Bell, Bennett, Berry, Beverly, Biggs, Bowman, Branham, Brave Boy, Bridger, Brogan, Brooks, Bunch, Brown, Butler, Bouillon, Burton, Buxton, Berg, Campbell, Carrigal, Carter. All these surnames that we have: Freeman, Dalton, Epps, Evans, Fields, French, Crow, Costello, Coleman, Coley, Collins, Cumbo, Dalton, Dare, Davis, Epps, Hall, Harvey, Hillman. I can go on. You got Hendricks, remember, like Jimi Hendrix. You have Harvey, Holmes, Hopkins, Jackson, Johnson, Jones, Kennedy, Langston, Lawson, Locklear, Lopez, like Lisa Left Eye Lopez. You have Mersch, Nichols, Newsom, Newman, Osborne, Oxidine, Page, Phipps, Pruitt, Phelps, Perry, Powell, Polly, Powers, Pritchard. I can go on. I'm not going to read Williams, Weaver, pretty much the standard surname, Chavis, all of this. You can find it, and it originates with these men that went into the Caribbean and came into the colony. And as a matter of fact, there are people that have noticed that there are certain surnames that the people from the Caribbean and Afro-Americans tend to share in common. And this is why, because we do share that in common, okay? That we have these individuals, Moorish, Sephardic, Jewish men that were misnomered as African slaves. They are the ones that came in and intermingled with the indigenous population in both places. So this is why we share these surnames. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so this is an article, and this is it also comes in a book written by Paul Heinig. I'm sure many of your listening audience heard of Paul Heinig. A lot of us reference his references when we're doing genealogy. Paul Heinig is an engineer. He's of Jewish background, actually. He's white, Caucasian, and he's married to an Afro-American woman. And due to her frustrations with her genealogy, he took it upon himself to dedicate himself to going to the court records and actually making these records tangible. So now we can find them on the internet, or we can order his book, because all he basically did was copy records wherein we would have to go in person in the past, okay, to courthouses and libraries and things of that nature. So here is an article that he has called Free African Americans of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide because I'm showing this for a reason. Okay, so what I have highlighted is the first recorded person on the record, Emmanuel Driggers, and it said, it's up at the top, he's a Negro, born say 1620, and they say that he was the slave of Francis Pott on his plantation in MacArthur Bay, Northampton County, Virginia. Now, why am I showing this? Because when you go down to the highlighted portion on the bottom, they go on to explain the name Driggers was apparently short for the Portuguese or Spanish name Rodriguez, since he was called Manuel Rodriguez in most of his deeds. So now this is going back to what I said. These men were not from Africa. These were Portuguese. These were Portuguese origin black men that came from England. Remember, Queen Elizabeth I was complaining about too many blackamoors was in her realm?
Mm-hmm.
These are the men that were coming from England, but they did not originate from England. They were there maybe a couple of hundred years. They were already acculturated in England, but their ancestors came out of the Iberian Peninsula. This is why they had Iberian names, okay? So this is what I'm showing, all right? And this is in Paul Heinig's his resource. Okay, you could go to the next slide. Okay, I know this is hard to read, but the reason why I'm showing this because they're talking about the Nickens family, all right, and the Nickens family and the Weaver family, and it's what I have highlighted that I would want to emphasize. So let me just read what they're saying first. The Nickens family came from Lancaster County, where Black Dick, parentheses, Richard Nickens, his wife Chris, and their children were freed in 1690 by the will of John Carter. The family was associated with the Weaver family, descendants of 3 East Indian men who were free from their indentures in Lancaster County in 1708. Now, did anyone ever wonder where these South Asian Indian men, these are not indigenous people like American Indian, these are men with origins out of India who were in the colonies? Well, if you read the fine print that I have highlighted, they tell you where they're from. And what does the footnote say? It says, see freeafricanamericans.com East Indians for a number of East Indians who were free persons of color and slaves in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. They came over from England as indentured servants. So where do you think these other black men came from? They came from the same place. Why go to Africa when you had blacks who were already subjugated in England? You understand?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're getting into the genetic proof. So I talked about Haiti and how Haiti, just like the southeast part of the United States, just like Jamaica, that the first people that were coming out of Europe were the Iberian Moors, the Sephardic Jews, who are really ethnically the same population, okay? They really have their origins, if you take it back, out of North Africa, okay? So let me emphasize that. Now, it would be too cumbersome to go back, but I will tell you that in the first presentation, I spoke of a genetic pattern called the Amizigh pattern, and that it was different from West Africans, and that the North African Berber Amizigh people do not have 1 to 2 genetic categories, but that they have 4 genetic categories simultaneously. And I noticed that. The only time you don't get to see that is if they're highly miscegenated and they're given a category of North Africa, which is based on the miscegenated population. But if I showed a Tunisian who wasn't too mixed in part 1, and I showed that that Tunisian had the 4 categories. Well, we're going to revisit. If we notice the Haitian, you will see that the Haitian is showing these 4 categories as well as the genetic pattern. Remember I said the Nigerian, the Ghanaian, the Senegambian, and then you have the Bantu. And notice that the Haitian has that. Let's go to the next slide. Because this is a continuation of the ancestor. So this is the Haitian, the same Haitian individual. And you will see, if you look at the European part, which is based on the pale population that's currently there, you will see the Northwest European, you see the Southern European, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. Notice it didn't say French. Not to say that this individual doesn't have pale French lineage, but what I'm showing is that in the DNA, the history still shows. So you can see that a source of this individual's DNA, many Haitians have this. This is not someone I just cherry picked. Many Haitians have this, regardless of how they look, regardless of how dark they are. Many of them will still show Iberian DNA based on the population that's near there now. And if you notice, consistent with what I said, you see a little tiny bit of North African, because again, that's based on the miscegenated population in North Africa. So what I'm showing is that this African DNA that came in was not from no West Central Africa, primarily. It was primarily out of Europe. This is an Amizigh North African pattern. And the source was the Iberian Peninsula, because you still see the Iberian DNA. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
So when they keep saying that people came in from West Central Africa, that's not consistent with the DNA. This person has the Amizigh pattern, the same as someone who, like the unmixed Tunisian that I showed in part 1. And not only that, this person was colonized by the French, but yet you see the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the DNA is a reflection of the history, because the Spanish and the Portuguese Moors, who were brought there by the paler population, came into what became Haiti first, just like Jamaica and many of the other islands. Okay, next slide. So this is a person from Jamaica. And again, what do you notice? The Nigerian, the Ghanaian, the Senegambian, and the Bantu, in this case, the Congolese. Again, an Army-Zog pattern. Next slide. This is just a continuation of this person's DNA, the same individual from Jamaica. Now, what do you see? Let's look at the European. This is where the Moors came from. You now see this person has British and Irish based on the pale population out of Britain and Ireland. But did you not notice when you look down, you see the Spanish and the Portuguese? And also a little Ashkenazi Jewish.
It's kind of small on my end. I
It's
can't
small.
really make that.
If you want to blow it up, you can. But what I'm showing is that initial DNA that came in with those Moors is still there, because remember, the DNA doesn't go anywhere. The population mixes among themselves and the DNA is still there.
I forget how you make this bigger.
I think you went up to you got to go up to zoom. Go up to your ledger till you see zoom. Move that arrow up. Go move that, yeah, until you find zoom. Slide back and forth till you see zoom. No, go down to go to the next line until you find zoom. No, your left side. No.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Zoom.
Okay, you see, this is, what you have to do is realize, once you understand that the paler population was bringing the Moors out of their areas, then it all makes sense. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
If you could slide down, I was showing. Right. See, this individual has the Spanish and the Portuguese. Why? Because they were the first ones there. And they brought their dominated Moors with them to mine, and they were the first slaves on the island, along with the Caribs and Arawaks, Tainos. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why it's small in percentage is because it happened before the Northwest Europeans and the English started kicking their Moors out and using them as slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide. We'll see this repeated again. Slide up. All righty. So this is another Jamaican. And by the way, I see this with a number of people out of the Caribbean, whether it's Antigua, Jamaica. And you might want to reduce this a little bit. Again, this individual has the Amizigh pattern that I keep talking about, which is a North African pattern. It's the combination of the three West African genetic groups plus the Bantu group. You can see the Nigerian, you can see the Ghanaian, and you can see the Senegambian, which is a reflection of the North African population, who were the Moorish population who accompanied the Spaniards when they came into Jamaica and the other islands initially. And I want to point something else. We're going to go down a little bit. You see that, Somali? Can someone tell me what is a Jamaican or anybody out of the Caribbean or out of the colonies doing with Somali DNA? Well, for many of you who've participated in 23andMe, you will notice that many of your relatives, some of you will have Eritrean, Ethiopia. They're very tiny, but they are a clue. Remember I said earlier that the Amizigh people had roots out of the Horn and that they migrated into Northwest Africa? This is proof that this is the Amizigh DNA. He is still showing vestiges of the Horn African. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Because how do you explain how he has it? Because this is not just an isolated incident. This is a repeated pattern. We will see these these Northeast Horn African DNA markers. Sometimes you'll see tiny Sudanese, sometimes you will see Eritrean, and it will be very, very tiny. And it's a reflection of the migration of the Amizigh people, the North Africans who eventually went into the Iberian Peninsula. Because you will find out, if you read history, that a great source of the people that were the Moors that went into the Iberian Peninsula, they came out of the region of Algeria. Okay, so keep that in mind because there's further proof of it. Next slide. And this is the rest of his genetic composition. And what did I say? It was Amizigh. So because you do have miscegenated populations in North Africa based on the repeated combination of Southern Europeans, West Asians out of the Levant, and the original population, it creates a genetic community called North African, which is a modern construct. So if you look down, you'll see he has a tiny little bit of North African, which represents the modern mixed population in North Africa. If you bring that slide down, you'll see what I'm talking about. This is why many of us who take these DNA tests, we get these tiny North African markers. It doesn't mean the rest of his DNA is not North African. It's a reflection of the fact that he caught some of the modern mixture, okay? Because that mixing started happening from the Umayyad dynasty and, stuff like that. So he caught some of that because many of his ancestors, in fact, were the Moors who came in. Next slide. Yep. This is an example of what I'm talking about. What is Jamaican doing with Egyptian DNA, North African DNA? I'm not saying that you don't have people migrating and modern mixing, but this is in context of what I look at all the time. And these are not people who have any grandfather or great grandfather who come out of Egypt, all right, or Somalis. These are all markers that routinely we see. Next slide. Okay, can we reduce that a little bit?
More?
I'm trying to see if the audience can catch the whole thing. If not, well, we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there because you don't want to. Okay, this is someone from. Oh, pardon me. This is someone from the island of Montserrat. Now, the island of Montserrat is an island that is very special in terms of studying Moorish DNA. And let me tell you why. Because Montserrat being a very tiny island, the fact that there's no recorded slave ships straight from Africa, aside from allegedly 10 ships, and the fact that their population is brown to very dark skin, and many of them are quite African in appearance, and we know that they have a strong connection culturally to Ireland. We know their slave rebellion was on St. Patrick's Day. We know that by the late 1600s, 70% of their enslaved population has been said to come out of Ireland, but no one tells you whether it's a white Irish or a black Irish. They just assume that you will think white Irish. And we know people from Montserrat are always speaking of Ireland. Well, one of the things I started noticing a few years ago was that populations that have a big allegiance, or put it this way, not so much allegiance, but a strong history of Irish slavery, they have a tendency to get Igbo matching on DNA tests. Okay, so the question becomes, is that from Igbo slave trading, or is that a reflection of a pattern that's coming out of Europe? Well, I was suspicious because I started seeing the correlation with Irish areas that were known for having a high percentage of Irish slaves historically, and Igbo matching. And the reason why I pretty much guessed that the Montserrat people would have Igbo matching was because of that pattern. Okay, so I sampled a full Montserrat man. His lineage goes back to Montserrat on both sides. He was born and bred there, and he volunteered to have me check his DNA out. And I guessed he would match Igbo, and that's exactly what happened. So I can rest assure you that a lot of this Igbo matching that many of us are getting, that's nothing but a signal of the Blackamoors out of the Ireland area and even Scotland. Okay, because you cannot say that this is from Nigeria directly. And remember, if you recall, in part 2, I talked about the historical evidence that you had West African DNA in Northwest Europe that goes back to the Roman Empire. So we know West Africans, not directly from West Africa, but we know Africans of West African type of genetics was well established in Northwest Europe, and it goes back to the Roman Empire. So that goes back to what I'm saying. Just because you have West African type DNA does not mean it comes directly from West Africa. But understand that all of this DNA was in Europe by an established population. Okay, next slide. And this is, can you slide it? All right, I'm slide down. Slide down. Okay, and you can see, just like I keep saying, this is part of this Montserrat man's DNA. And what do you see? Remember I said that the original people, not the original people, but that the Spaniards came into these areas and they carried their Moors. Now, let me just say this about Montserrat. That doesn't quite apply to the island of Montserrat. So what is he doing with an Amizigh pattern? This goes back to, I don't know if you would remember, in part 2, I spoke of an article that noticed that a certain percentage of Irish people have links to the Tuaregs of North Africa, who are Berber-like people. Well, what if I tell you, because this man is a descendant of the Blackamoor from Ireland, he would have the Berber pattern, the Amizigh pattern, and we're looking right at it. He has the the 3 West African groups, the Bantu group, and he has what? The Northeast African or Horn African tiny percentage, which again reflects the source of the Amazigh people before they migrated into North and Northwest Africa. So again, all of this is consistent. Next slide. Or slide down, please. Please slide down. Don't. Let's finish the slide. And where is he from? Northwest Europe. Ireland. Okay, next slide. Slide up, please. A little down. I want them to see the European DNA. Okay, this is the Montserrat man. Remember that I said that they based the European DNA based on the population that's there now, the Pale population? Well, remember I said wherever the Pale population dominated the Moors in their area, those were the slaves. They weren't from Africa, they were from Europe. Notice where his European DNA is from. Ireland. It's not even from anywhere else, just Ireland. Okay, so if you see Igbo that's the signature of the blackamoors. Now let me explain something here, because why are you seeing him with this Amizigh pattern? You're also seeing the Igbo. What's going on? Those are two different types of Africans, right? Exactly. Because the first people that settled in Ireland was a natural extension of the North African population, okay? They're not far apart. Europe and North Africa are adjacent to one another. So the earlier part of his DNA is an Amizigh, right? So this is not the same situation as what happened in Haiti, Jamaica, and other islands. This is Montserrat. So this man, primarily, his lineage is primarily coming straight out of Ireland. He doesn't share that history of the Spaniards coming in. So he doesn't have any Iberian DNA, not really, not much. His main European DNA is out of Ireland. And the reason he has the Amizigh pattern is because Amizigh, North African type of people, were living there. But then the reason you see the Igbo and the pronounced Nigerian DNA in this individual, because the Roman Empire brought in the West African type of DNA that came in later. Okay? So the Northwest Moors, just like an Uptown Girl who had the Isan Yoruba DNA, and I showed that in part 2. And her grandfather was 100% Isan Yoruba, and he was a noble. These are the people that came with the Roman Empire who settled in Northwest Europe. Okay? So you have a combination of an Iberian type, you have a combination of a North African Moor, which is the older part of his DNA, which was established in a lot of Europe by just natural extension. And then you have the West African type of DNA that came in with the Roman Empire. Okay? That's why I was showing the Europeans in the last presentation. Before I finished the last presentations, I was showing the Italians with the Ghanaian DNA, the Nigerian DNA. You have to understand that's coming out of the Roman Empire. And we know Italy was like the seat of the Roman Empire. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is an individual who, actually, this is Chief Lavelle. This is his father. This is his father's DNA, and Chief Lavelle knows his lineage on both sides. His family goes back to the Tuscarora chiefs on his father's side, and this is his father's DNA. So again, what we're looking at is an Amizigh pattern. Now, I don't expect your listening audience to remember this, but if you go back to part 1, I showed the Algerian, and the Algerian had the same Fula and Wolof. Fula is Fulani, same pattern, an Algerian. And the Tunisian. Okay, this is an Amizigh pattern, the Nigerian, the Ghanaian, the Senegambian. And then you have the Bantu, except we already had a surplus of Bantu type DNA, and I deal with that in other lectures. Okay, you can go down a little bit. Is that as far you can go down?
Let's see.
Then go
Yes.
to the next. Then go to the next slide.
Okay.
We're getting there. Just bear with me. I know this is. I know.
We have 15 minutes of talk time, and then 15 minutes for the Q&A.
Okay, so let me get through this. I can actually. I think I could do this. So let me get through it. So go to the next slide. No, actually, this is the next slide. Can you
Move it up.
Okay, so this is Lavelle's father again. All right, and you can see, as I mentioned before, where these Amizigh people came from, when you start talking about the colonies, that's a British pattern. So you can see the pale European part of his DNA is out of what? Britain, England. I mean, that's our history, because, you know, we're from the colonies. So this is someone out of the colonies. So you can see that's the source of the DNA. And we saw with Paul Heinig's resource that those men were coming out of England. So this is just lining up. And you can see he has the Austronesian markers that Tyrone Lewis Cannon spoke of. And so in his studies that we possess, okay, that almost 100% of us possess. You can see his father has it. He has the Austronesian. You will have to slide down to see it. That's the Mongol native. You know, we mixed with them. And then you have the Filipino and the Austronesians who actually came here first, okay, before the Mongol natives came here. All right, you can go to the next slide. Okay, you can just slide up a little bit. No, slide down a little bit. Okay, slide down a little bit. All right, stop right there. Stop right there. No, slide up a little. All right. Okay, so this is a random so-called African American, and this is her DNA. Now, this is an example of what I see. This is the MDLP, and you can see here, if you look at her secondary populations, what do you see? So they keep telling us we came as slaves from West Central Africa, but look at the populations that are showing up. Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Amhara, which is a group from Ethiopia, Berber. What is she doing with this DNA? And by the way, this is not uncommon. I see this a lot. What is she doing with the DNA? Remember, I said that these men were North African that came into the colonies. So if something is true, it shows up in more than one place. Next slide. This is an example of what I'm talking about. This is called the Map My Genes of sequencing. This is another type of DNA test where they look at genetic similarity. So they match your DNA across world populations, and basically the strength of the circle, the bigness of the circle represents genetic closeness. So this is a so-called African American, okay? So if you look at the test population that the so-called African American matches the closest, you will see here that the largest population that they match is in the United States, and that just makes sense. So he's basically, or she is matching the population that they are part of, an Afro-American test population out of Denver. But I want you to pay attention. Notice the biggest circle after that is where? Algeria, in North Africa. And then you see a little bit of Nigeria. You can see some smaller dots in Mexico area. And, you know, it would require you to expand that, and you don't have to because we need to move it. But you will see tiny dots all throughout Europe. This is just representing genetic similarity. So what I'm showing, what is an Afro-American doing with the biggest circle outside of the North American area being in Algeria, North Africa? Okay? That's consistent with what I just finished talking about. Next slide. This is another so-called Afro-American. Look at that huge circle in North America, which of course represents his population. Look at that huge circle in North Africa.
Wow.
Okay. Now this person also has enslaved lineage, you know, the whole Irish, and so you're going to also see that big circle out of Nigeria. You will see people who tend to have the Irish Scottish lineage. They will have larger circles in the Nigerian area. And the first slide I showed is someone who really didn't have enslaved lineages. They came out of free lines. So if they came out of free lines, you're dealing basically with the men who came out of Europe who were of the Iberian, Moorish, Sephardic, Jewish lineage, and that is a North African lineage. So this is someone who has the enslaved lineage, which will come out of the Northwest Europe, which will be more of the West African, Nigerian type. So you will see a larger circle in the Nigerian area, but nevertheless, because we all come from mixing with the original men who came out of England, the Iberian Moors and the Sephardic Jews, we will all have the match out of North Africa, which this person does. Next slide. And the only reason I'm showing this slide, this is an individual. She's a mestiza from Honduras. So has the similar genetic makeup to what we would call a Mexican today. And I'm only showing this because I'm just showing the consistency of this particular test. And you can see that her greatest matches are in Spain and the Canary Islands. And you can see she has a little bit more pronounced matching in the Mexico Central region, which is based on that population there. So I'm just showing that this is consistent, okay? Her European map is more prominent, and you can see this is just consistent. So you can see this DNA type of sequencing and matching all lines up. Next slide. I think you skipped the slide. Oh, yeah, that's it. All right. So this is also a type of DNA test. What sequencing? That was the map, my genes I was showing on those maps. This is a type of DNA test. So I've said numerous times in my prior lectures that if you want to see the truth, you got to go beyond the traditional results given from Ancestry, MyHeritage, 23andMe. So we got to use third-party tests to see what's going on. So remember I said that the Amizigh people migrated from the Horn, and that they migrated and settled in North Africa, and they mixed with the ancient Bafour people who were the antecedents of West Africans, right? So this is an individual who happens to be my uncle. So this is a so-called Afro-American. And what do you see at the top? What are his matches? Ethiopia, Nigeria, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Senegal, Central Africa Republic. So remember I said that the Amizigh people have the matches to Nigeria, Senegambia. You got the Gambia, Sierra Leone. They also mix that up with Ghana. They don't use Ghana here. They use Sierra Leone. And then you have the Bantu, which is the Kenya. You have Senegal. And then you have Central African Republic, which is another type of Bantu people. But what is my uncle doing with Ethiopia? Okay, because again, the people that came into the colonies were what? Amizigh descendants. So they came out of the Horn originally, and it shows up in the DNA. Okay, and if you slide down, he also has DNA out of Greece, the Balkan, Romania. No, the test is not useless. You know, I mean, if you don't want to take the test, it's fine, but don't say the test is not useless. I'm basically showing that the test is consistent with the history. I'm proving the source. I'm proving that people didn't primarily directly. I'm not saying there wasn't a transatlantic slave trade, but I'm actually proving that a great source of the people that came in were the Moors. You don't have to take the test. I'm not trying to convince anybody to take the test. I'm just showing through the DNA test that the source of the so-called African slave was primarily the Moors. Okay, I'm not saying it was exclusive, but primarily, because that's what's showing on the DNA test. Okay, next slide.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think what she's saying here, if you have no oral history of enslaved ancestors, then taking the test is useless. That's what
Well,
she
the
said.
original people came in as indentured servants. You could play, you could play word games and say they weren't enslaved, but what is that? So people who come from free people of color descend from the original indentured servants. That's a form of slavery. I mean, we could go back and forth on that, but that's slavery to me. That's subjugation.
Yes, it is.
All right.
And then too, if you don't do a thorough genealogical study of your family, then you may have it and you don't even know.
Exactly. I
Exactly.
mean, that's sort of thinking that only the British, that's thinking that the people who came out of the Scotland, England, the slaves that came out of Scotland and Ireland, those are the real slaves. But the people that came in from the 1600s who did like maybe 7 years of indentured servitude, who then bought land, they weren't slaves. That was a form of slavery too. It's just that, unfortunately, for the people that came later, they got the brunt of it because they started changing over to chattel slavery by the late 1600s, but it's still a form of slavery. It's just, I understand the ego doesn't like to think, well, my ancestors weren't enslaved, but that is a form of slavery. All right. Next slide.
That is the next slide. Oh, you
Okay.
want me to skip this one?
Yeah, this basically is an article. It's basically from the Guardian. A friend of mine actually shared it with me, and it's consistent with what I talk about. This is an article. The Guardian is actually a journal from Australia. It's an Australian journal, and it talks about African slaves in colonial Australia. But there's something that they mention that's very, very key. That shows up on the next slide.
So go to the next one.
Yes, please.
Okay.
And it's what I have highlighted. Thousands of black families. You have to go up for that one. No. Thousands of black families have been living in England for hundreds of years as slaves and as free men. By the late 1500s, there were so many Africans in London that Queen Elizabeth I passed the draft proclamation of 1601 to stop further African immigration. They just don't tell you where they were coming from. They were coming from the Iberian Peninsula. Okay? Now, the part that I have highlighted. Now, this is what I'm showing. The point I'm showing is the point of this is to show that during this period, there was a sizable black population living in England. It wasn't white, as we're often led to believe.
Exactly.
Now, the highlighted portion says, for those who remained in London after the 1600s, life was not easy. In 1786, the plight of the African English was so bad that £900 was donated by the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. Destitute, some turned to crime to eat. They were duly arrested and sentenced to the colonies. So they put it right here. This is in an Australian journal. They didn't say they came from Africa. These people are from England. And it says these poor people went from slavery to what? Penal servitude. Right there in black and white.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you I'm actually coming to an end, but it's up to you, Fierce.
Okay. How many more slides?
Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I mean, we could skip the Q&A.
I can get through this. Let's be done with this. Let's be done with this. I can get through this.
Okay.
I'm gonna move fast because I explained the most complicated parts of it. Okay, so now we're getting into Ireland and Scotland slaves. So this is how most people are trained to think. When we start talking about chattel slavery, this is the focus because the slaves the indentured servants that came out of England, they basically became free. That's the Anthony Johnsons, who was originally Antonio. The Manuel Driggers, who was the Emmanuel Driggers, who was originally Manuel Rodriguez. Those guys basically did their tenure. They ended up being free, and they created the free people of color. Okay, when we start talking about chattel slavery, that's when you start seeing the cleansing out of Northwest Europe. And this is how a lot of people are thinking of, well, these are the slaves. Okay, so now you got the Ireland and the Scottish slaves. Okay, and let's see who they were. Next slide. So a key here is to, let me read this. During the mid 1600s, okay, Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua, Montserrat, to the extent that 70% of the total population of Montserrat consisted of Irish slaves. Let's pay attention to that. Ireland became an important source of human stock for English merchants. Ireland's population fell from 1.5 million to 600,000, 1641 to 1652, when more than 500,000 Irish were killed by the English and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Families were torn apart because Irishmen were forbidden to take their wives and children with them, which led to a sizable population of homeless women and children that was resolved by auctioning them into slavery. Sounds familiar? During the 1650s, in the region of 100,000 Irish children between ages 10 to 14 were taken from parents to be sold as slaves in the West Indies and New England. In this decade, 52,000 Irish, mostly women and children, were sold to where? Barbados and Virginia, and 30,000 Irish men and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. 1656, Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves to English settlers.
Wow.
Next slide. So the main thing out of this, what is less well known are the large number of Scots, estimated at around 100,000, were rounded up and transported to the colonies to be sold into slavery, many of them as a result of the Highland clearances. Remember that, Highland clearances. After the union with England in 1707, and particularly after the 1745 Jacobite Rising, political prisoners were regularly sold into slavery, and the 1746 Act of Proscription stated that anyone wearing tartan or Highland dress would be transported. Next. People from the British Isles mainly, but not only Irish and Scots, sentenced to transportation for petty crimes, others kidnapped, were put in chains, then packed into ships that transported hundreds of them bound for Virginia, Boston, New York, Barbados, and the West Indies. Doesn't this sound familiar? The white slaves were treated the same or even worse than the black slaves. But see, they're not telling you the color of these Irish and the Scots, okay? White slaves did not sell for a good price at auctions. Thus, it had been recorded that planters treated blacks better than their Christian white servants. Okay, next slide. So look what we have here. This is an article based on a tapestry that's actually shown in a museum. It's called The Search for the West Indian Man Who Stood Alongside the Jacobites at Culloden. So in Culloden, there was the Battle of Culloden. It was a Jacobite rebellion. And just slide down a little and look at what shows on the tapestry. They have a tapestry that shows a figurine of a black man. And what does it say? Work is underway to trace the identity of a black man who was believed to have been on the field with the Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden. Okay? But what is he doing there? Next slide. Slide up a little. Research is now underway to find out the identity of the man in the tapestry, which hangs at the Battle of Culloden Visitor Center, and the story behind his journey to the Highlands. Okay, so what is he doing there? And he's in uniform. Okay, next slide. All right, then sign off. Bye. Okay, Miss Melvin said that Britain had been for centuries if not millennia, a bustling scene of ethnic diversity, with it known Black people lived in Scotland since at least Roman times. So here again, we're hearing about the Roman period. The tapestry now being researched was acquired by National Trust for Scotland to display at Culloden in 2007. Next slide. So I know many of your listening audience talked about the Jacobite gleanings. Can you remove her comment? It's disturbing me.
Yes, please remove it.
Yeah, remove her comment. I don't even want to look at it. It's disturbing.
She's negative.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Jacobite gleanings from state manuscripts, short sketches of Jacobites, the transportation in 1745 by Macbeth Forbes. And a number of people, YouTubers who talked about this, they've presented this. And this basically, next slide, please. They describe some of the Jacobites who were sent over to the Caribbean. And we have here George Hume, age 30, marked as a Black man whose color would no doubt suit the West Indies. And, you know, I'm not going to, just to save on time, we can move on because, you know, many of us are quite familiar with this and we've seen this. We have the list from transportation in 1745 of the Jacobites, the rebels, and they have their names: Campbell, you know, you have the, you know, brown, black, curly head, strong made, ruddy complexion, brown, swarthy, you know, and these are the men that they transported. And they said which were taken to Antigua, the Leeward Islands. So the Leeward Islands also includes Montserrat as well, and Antigua and different places in the Caribbean as well. Next slide. Okay, so as I said, when something is true, it shows up in more than one place. So this is one of the Jamaican individuals. And so Jamaica now being a very, an island where you had the Iberian Moors coming in, you had the Arawak and the Taino Carib population already established there. You had the merging of those two populations. And then, of course, you had the Irish and the Scottish slaves. And now we're fully aware that a lot of those people were melanated. So it should, all of this should show up, if it's true, in the DNA. So let's look at the secondary populations. What do you see there? Similarity to what? You have Afro-American. We're not surprised about that because you had the going back and forth of people from the islands to the colonies and the colonies to the islands. So he has evidence of shared lineage with the people from the colonies. And then, of course, you have the Spanish, the Basque, the French. You have the French, the Portuguese, the Sardinian, and then you have the English. And then this is what I want people to see. I want you to slide down a little bit. I particularly want them to see this. What do you have there? Scottish Highlands. So again, these are based on the population, the paler populations that are there now. But understand, we mixed with the paler population. They came in and we mixed with them because there was a mixing of these people. Basically, these people are our family members. Just because the relationship is antagonistic doesn't change that they are our family members. So he still will have matches to the Highland area, the same area where the Jacobites came from. So it's showing up in his DNA. Next slide. So this is just more history. By the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua, Montserrat. At that time, 70% of the total population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. Ireland quickly became the biggest source of human livestock for English merchants. From 1641 to 1652, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell. I spoke about this before. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is Montserrat. This is an article from the Irish Times. The Caribbean Irish, the other Emerald Isles. So you could see, slide down, let's look at their phenotype. So we're talking about 70% by the 1700s. 70% of their island was Irish. They're not even light skinned. All right, next slide. And you can see them wearing their green. This is a film that was done on the Black Irish of Montserrat, and you can see the girls' faces. And I want you to, that's a boy and a girl, pardon me. I want you to notice something. Notice those foreheads, particularly the girl on the left. Can you go to the previous slide? Notice that boy? You notice that forehead? With his hands up? Okay, go to the next slide again. Okay, we see that forehead. Go to the next slide. So we have Joseph Williams, who wrote about the Black Irish, whence the Black Irish from Jamaica. If you zoom in, notice those boys' foreheads. Even though I'm focusing on DNA, I'm just pointing something else out. There is a phenotype. You notice some of them have that prominent forehead. In fact, most of them do.
I noticed that Ethiopian people have prominent foreheads as well.
You notice those foreheads? The Black Irish. All right, next slide. Yeah, it carries on.
Rihanna, definitely.
Right, she has it. And she's, Bayesian and Guyanese. But a lot of the Guyanese come out of Barbados, so it's really the same genetic pool.
She has light eyes too.
Yeah, but look at her. Look at that signature forehead.
Yeah,
my family comes out of Barbados too.
I'm winding down, almost done. Okay, next slide. Okay, the stew's origin and cultural impact. All right, so this is talking about goat water stew. Goat water is actually a Montserratian spin-off of Irish stew, and there's actually other versions of it that they may call it something different in other Caribbean islands, but it actually is a form of Irish stew. Instead of goat, Irish stew is traditionally made with sheep meat, and they just start describing it. So again, we see the impact, the cultural impact on the food. Okay, next slide. That's just talking about goat water, how it's the Montserrat national dish. Okay,
we got 1 minute.
Okay, go ahead. Next.
Oh, next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
We actually showed him before. That was the Montserrat DNA. Oh, yeah. Next slide. Next slide. You can see. Next slide. And that's his genetic sequencing. And you can see here, he has genetic similarity to the people here in the United States. We're not surprised about that because we do share lineage with the people from the Caribbean. And we also have, for some of us, or many of us actually, we have lineage from the Moors out of Europe. And you can see he matches the population out of Nigeria, okay? But it's an indirect. Now, next slide, and I'll end it right here. I think I can end it right here. The last two slides. This is his DNA breakdown using sequencing. And if you look at the top, what did I say? That the original people in Ireland were actually an extension of the North Africans, and that shows up in his DNA. So what do you have? You have the Nigerian. There you see that Ethiopian, the Sierra Leone, Gambian, Kenya. What I wanted to point out, what is he doing with Russian DNA? The reason why is because when you study the DNA of the paler population that's there now, they will tell you that they came out of the Russian steppes. So remember, these people didn't just get there. So there was a merging of the Pale population that came in from the Russian steppes area, Central Asia area, with the Blackamoors and the descendants of the original Amizigh people. So he shows the matching of Russia. So it's consistent with the migrations that came in, even though it's from the paler population, they intermingled with him. And you will notice he has some matches to Greece, Bulgaria, and that's I'm running out of time, but those are all signatures of Romani Gypsy DNA, which a lot of us also get, which is another point of evidence that a lot of our lineage came out of Europe. Next slide. And it will be the last slide. And this is a continuation, and you will see he has those matches to where? Algeria, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, a little bit of Iranian, because again, the DNA was what? Originally North African, and then you had the Roman Empire bringing in the West African type of DNA. And on that note, even though there was a few more slides left, I will end it here.
How many more?
1, 2, 3. It's about maybe I can skip. I can skip a few.
Unless you want to do another part, rather than rush it.
I'm gonna be honest. It's not a really. I feel I can rush it because I'll be honest. It's not gonna be anything. If I come back and discuss these slides, it's gonna be like that's it. Bye.
Okay.
Yeah. I can finish this up. This is good.
Are you going to have time to do Indigenous of the Americas?
Oh yeah, I definitely would like to come back if Fierce to have me back. I have something good for that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I had a quite a few questions, but I can hold them for next time.
Oh yeah, I have something good. I have something good for you. So anyway, this is what I wanted to show. So they keep saying that we come straight from West Africa. So this is a Ghanaian who took the same test. These are their results. They have genetic similarity to Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. Where's the North African pattern? You see, where's the Ethiopian? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
So if we came directly from just straight from these areas, if we just strictly came from West Central Africa, where is the North? Where are the DNA markers that they have that we have? That's what I'm showing. You see my point?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
We had all of these other markers from North Africa, Algeria, Yemen, and we had a mixture which was similar to the patterns seen in North African people. But there you just have 3 areas that a Ghanaian, is matching. Next slide. Okay, so this would be the ancestry DNA results of a person from Montserrat. This is a young lady who did her grandmother's DNA, and I wanted to show you that when you do ancestry DNA, you can see they use Benin Togo. They don't have an Igbo matching. You will find that the people out of Montserrat tend to get high Benin Togo percentages, and that's what I'm showing. Okay. And go down a little bit further, and you can see the paler matching is to Ireland and Scotland. Notice you don't see any other European?
Right.
Because Montserrat is very unique in that they didn't have, they're not like Jamaica and some of the other islands where you had the Spaniards, then you had the British coming in. They're very simple. The people that came in were from Ireland, and any intermixing was with the local population. So that's where what I'm showing is that whatever African DNA we tend to have reflects the area of Europe that they came from. Okay? That's what I'm showing. Next slide. You can slide up. Oh no, the previous. No, I'm sorry. Go back. I'm sorry. Go forward. Next slide.
Go down.
Okay, no, that's just we can move from that. Okay, yes, this is what I wanted to show. This is someone, again, I've showed this slide before just to give context to it. So this is a person who has a lot of Irish and Scottish lineage, Northwest European, and they're from Europe. Now look at what they have. Remember I showed that large Benin Togo in the Montserrat women?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go down. Let's look at the rest of his DNA results.
We got 1 minute.
Okay, 1% Benin Togo. You see that? That's the vestige. When they cleansed out Ireland, they sent their population into the Caribbean and into the colonies, but you had a little bit of leftover, and this shows in a person from there. So I will end that. I pretty much did mostly everything. Okay.
Okay. You have a question in the chat from Brave Cold Water, and he's asking, would you say there is in fact a significant amount of admixture of European within some Nigerian Igbo people? Thanks,
No,
Doc.
I would. You're very welcome. No, I mean, you do have some people from certain areas that have some evidence of some slight admixture because they are on the coastal areas. So you see some people with lighter eyes. So there was some Portuguese coming there on the coast, and if you look at their DNA, you can look at archaeogenetics and other DNA tests, not in terms of recent mixtures. So most of them will get 100% Nigerian. But if you go to third-party tests, you will see some of them have evidence of some mixtures with the Portuguese and, like that. But I wouldn't call that a significant admixture of European in a modern context. But I showed in part 1, or was it part 2? It was in the prior parts. I showed that West Africans do have ancient lineage to the ancient Europeans. They had some sort of connection to Neolithic brown Europeans and East Africans and North Africans and in the Levant area. So you had a migration coming down into West Africa from different sources.
Okay. Any other questions for the doc that anybody in the listening audience has? If so, ask them now. And let's see. And Brave Coldwater says, thanks, Doc. Are you also familiar with the Levant region admixture in some Igbo as well as some northern Cameroons?
I would say yes. I've seen results of Igbo people who participated in archaeogenetic studies, and they will get matches to ancient Phoenician sites, North African sites. So yes. And I also showed in my Lebanese sample The Lebanese individual in the secondary populations, he had some matches to West African groups, which also shows that those populations were in that region. He had matches to Igbo, Akan groups, Mandinka, Senegambian groups, Yoruba, which shows that these groups were not always in West Africa. And I also showed that, showing the haplotype map of the sickle trait, which is called, there are different haplotypes. You have the Bantu type, which is more in Central Southern Africa. You have the Benin type of sickle haplotype, and you will see a predominance, as we expect in West Africa, but you see a pronounced presence in the Levant, Southern Europe, and North Africa. So that speaks to the fact that they were not always in their current location. So we have a number of evidence.
You said they were in Europe for thousands of years. Did they migrate historically because of wars, economics?
You're talking about West Africans?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, West Africans, there are a number of reasons for migrations. You had the desiccation of the desert. So you had the people, the Bafour, and those people who basically became the Mandi speakers, who are really the parents of a good portion of West Africans. They started migrating down to more fertile areas. Then, of course, you had in more modern history, you had Islamic Africans who were converting animists, or trying to, and then you had Africans who were not trying to convert to Islam. So you had a type of migration for that reason, moving further down into the forest belt. Then you had more ancient migrations. You have the Roman Empire, and you had the Assyrian Empire, and you have migrations down into the interior region of the African continent, coming from the wars taking place in those regions. So there was just hits from different areas.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions you wanted to ask, Farbert?
As far as Haiti and the Santo Dominican Republic, can you tell me what their DNA once again was made up of?
Okay, so what happens is that the original genesis of the Haitian and Dominican people were the same, uh, which was a combination of the Taino Arawak people, the original population, mixed in with the Moorish, Sephardic Jewish, the Iberian, Afro-African population.
Man, Doc, you looking to start a fight now, boy? Don't tell a Dominican that.
Yeah,
I was thinking the same thing because
well, that's what it is. And see, this is why Haitians will tell you that there are many words in their Creole that goes back to Taino, and that's because it comes out of that genesis. See, the genesis of the Haitian and the Dominican people were the same. Where they part is that once the French took over that part of the island, the French started bringing direct Africans in. That's why if you speak to someone from the Congo, they will tell you that if they overhear Haitians speak their language, okay, they can recognize Congolese words because that slave trade took place. This is why I'm not here to say that the transatlantic slave trade didn't take place. What I'm saying is that we have to study different regions of our people because it's not a one size fit all.
I want to add something into that to confirm what you're saying. Because even in Haitian Voodoo, you have Congo rites in the religion, as well as you got some Yoruba in there too. You got you got a lot of different influences in the religion, coming from different. You got some coming from Arawak, you got some coming from Africa. So what you're saying lines up.
Yeah. That's the genesis
Well,
of the
in
Haitian.
my youth, um, a lot of Dominicans I knew at that time period, they gave you the impression that they were superior to the Haitians, and what
Right.
in reality, they were a part of Haiti, and they got their independence from Haiti years later.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't Dominican Republic wasn't a country, or Haiti wasn't either. They were both colonies, divided, and those rumors still kind of circulate to this day.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the division goes back also, whether it's a type of genetic memory, to the fact that what made the Haitians and the Dominicans different happened later on. You had more direct transport. After the initial colonization with the Spaniards and the Moors that mined the fields and joined forces with the Taino Arawaks, you had the French then that took over the Haitian side and brought in direct Africans. And that did not really happen on a large scale on the Spanish side, the Dominican side. And you have to also bear in mind that there was that prejudice that existed between Islamic Africans and animists and Christian Africans. So you can sort of say that prejudice is still there because the Haitian is more mixed recently with the animus that the French carried there, like the Congolese and those people, and the Dominicans are not. They are still just strictly descendants of Moors mixed with natives to that island. And although the Haitians have the same mixture, the difference lies into what took place in more recent years. That's all I'm saying.
Well, doctor, you open up another can of worms.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna have to close the show out. I gotta work in the morning, and so does my wife. She's waiting patiently to go to bed,
Tell us a hi.
and I sure will.
And thank her, because I
Thank
know.
you for our patience.
Yes.
Yeah, and we will pick this up again soon. And I
Hmm.
thank you, Doc, for sharing all of your knowledge of DNA with us.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And I thank you,
I wanted to ask,
Firebird.
in the future, I wanted to ask the doctor her findings on the lumbies again.
Yeah, we'll create another topic of discussion where we could go into that and related topics more in depth.
Hmm.
Um and then yeah, that'll make for another show.
You got it.
Yeah, and you have one more comment that just came in. Um, Haitian Revolution fake says interesting three-part segments. Islam, indeed, Islam noble.
You and the doctor have to make a documentary together.
Why not?
Yes, why not?
Yeah. And by the way, for y'all, those of y'all who don't know, the doc has done the introduction to my book, and also Firebird Grey Wolf is in the book. She left a review in the book as well. So we got two people who are a part of my book on the panel. Yeah.
I really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah. All right. So, okay, I'm going to sign out now. And I thank all of those who joined the chat and who are in the viewing audience as well. And I'm going to close out the show now. I thank you, Doc, for your wonderful work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. And Firebird, I thank you as well.
Oh, what a
All right. Okay, folks. I'm so sorry that we have to close out now, but we've reached that hour. Okay. And for those who enjoyed the presentation, you know, much respect. And I know there are those who didn't enjoy the presentation as well. And pardon the phone. I know that there's some people who may not have enjoyed the presentation as well, and everybody is entitled to their opinions, and their likes and dislikes. You know, it's all good. Okay. Anyway, so that's it, and we will bring the doc back on at another time. Okay. So right about now, I'm gonna sign out. Thank you all. Okay. Dodada Gahan E. Surnames. Ayo.